Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones or pagers at this time. We also ask that you please do not use MP3 players or text message during the performance. Also, flash photography or videotaping is strictly prohibited. And now, would you please welcome to the stage your moderator, Tony Stewart.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here for the final session of this year's symposium on humor and music. What a treat we have. We have two very famous people to come and to visit with me for an hour and to dialogue. As a matter of fact, during the lifetime of these two famous people, they did not dialogue. They did not know one another. In fact, one of them died 25 years before the other one. I'm very pleased, first of all, to give you the background of our first distinguished guest. I'm going to invite in a moment to the stage Mr. Will Rogers, who was born in 1879 and died in 1935 in a plane crash. He was born in the Indian Territory, and which would later become the state of Oklahoma, and he's very famous and was known as a cowboy, and he was also known as a rope twirler and an expert rider, and he was also on Wild West shows and in vaudeville, and went to Hollywood and was in many movies and did a column that was read all over the United States. In 1934, he was even voted as the most popular male actor in Hollywood. Please welcome to the stage Will Rogers.
Howdy.
And our second distinguished guest to engage in this dialogue is Samuel Clemens, of course, certainly better known as Mark Twain, who was an American humorist, satirist, writer, lecturer, and he wrote among his many works The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn and also The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He is best known as at his time, the most famous author in the United States, the most popular stand-up comedian and monologuist, and also simultaneously was friends of presidents and artists and even royalty in Europe. Please welcome to the stage Mr. Mark Twain.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho at North Idaho College for this dialogue, and what a privilege for me personally to be in the presence of two such famous people, and I'm somewhat humbled the fact that whatever I ask you, it'll get turned back on me with your humor, but I will do my best. First of all, Mr. Rogers, as I indicated in the introduction, you were born in the territory of Oklahoma, but it's my understanding when you moved to New York and later to Hollywood that you actually never lived as a resident in the state of Oklahoma.
Well, no, it's a great disappointment to my father that I've not been an official Oklahoman, because he thought that if I stayed there, I could go up with the state. But I had an opportunity to go into vaudeville in 1906, and I spent actually more time in the Schubert Theater than I spent in Oklahoma as a state. But I tell you, Oklahoma is coming right along. You know, we're not a very old state, but we're making progress. We've impeached 2 governors in the last decade. And we're going to catch right up with the rest of the country.
Well, I understand that your governors usually don't give us their mailing address, the mansion of the governor, because they may not be there when the letter arrives.
When they send laundry out, they just say, I'll pick it up.
Yes, that's the safest way to do that. Well, Mr. Mark Twain, you just heard. By the way, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Rogers.
It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
How would you react to his statement that, you know, in our times in 2007, he's honored as one of the famous people from Oklahoma? Is this a problem since he didn't really live in the state?
I don't think so. I think people have paid Mr. Rogers the highest compliment by asking him if he was the Mark Twain today. I also understand that they're irritated him a little bit.
Well, Mr. Mark Twain, you have done an awful lot of writing, and and Mr. Rogers has done a lot of writing. I'd like to get you to react to something that Mr. Will Rogers said here yesterday, and he actually said on television too. He has often been, I'm talking about writing styles, and yours are very different, and he was oftentimes criticized for his use of simple language, and that he didn't much like to study the dictionary. And first of all, before you respond, Mr. Rogers, explain why you had some skepticism about both telephone books and dictionaries, and we'll get Mr. Twain's reaction.
Well, a good friend of mine is a columnist in New York, Mr. McIntyre, Art McIntyre. He uses a lot of large words in his column, which I don't always understand. And when I asked him about them, he said, well, you should get a dictionary. And I said, well, I have one, but it takes so long to look up the words that I waste a lot of time and I finally decided it was like the telephone book. If there's somebody you want to call and you don't already know the number, then you don't need to talk to them. So a dictionary is like that. The Greeks have got a word for it, and the dictionary's got a word, but you need to use your own word. There's always a short word for something.
There is, and since I get paid 10 cents a word, I'm always going to use the smaller one. I never say policeman when I can say cop. They pay the same.
Well, it actually pays more money because if you use large words, your income would just about be decreased in half.
Exactly. And I have antipathy for dictionaries myself, because when I went west in the stagecoach with my brother Orion, he decided to bring a dictionary with him. And he put it up on the shelf, and every time we went down into the gulch and then came up, the dictionary came and hit one of us. There are a lot of gulches between St. Joe, Missouri, and Nevada.
Well, it seems like the dictionary could be a hazard, among other things. Yes. So,
well, it's a way of showing off for some people, I think.
Well, I met one of those students one time, and other students would say about him, he is so intelligent, and he said to me, I'm really not that intelligent, I just like studying the dictionary. So you might have impressed people more if you, would have thrown out one of those words there once in a while, as long as for Mr. Twain it didn't cost him too much money being paid by the word.
But using those big words, it just cultivates the cultivated class. And I don't think that's what I want to do.
Yes. Well, you both... I've only had one other experience in life more interesting, and that's when I had both of these gentlemen here with Dorothy Parker. And, speaking of Dorothy Parker, when she was here, she always contended, Mr. Rogers, that her work was not humorous. And she was almost offended when we would say that she was a humorist. And I recall that in your work, you always were not only a humorist, but very optimistic. Even though she's not here to defend herself, when you were here with her before, and you were also somewhat bored by her quoting a poem every time I asked her a question, and you made that point. So why would someone who was a humorist really like to deny they were?
Well, I don't know. I've always thought back from the time when I was in school, that there was something worthwhile in getting somebody to laugh at you. And, of course, there are different styles of humor. And maybe...
Mr. Twain
that's correct.
Mark Twain talked about that today.
His conversation this morning I thought was very, it shed some light on things. But Ms. Parker reminds me, although, it's a style of humor, that reminds me a little of President Coolidge. Now,
I believe he was your favorite president.
Wouldn't put them together, and I liked Mr. Coolidge. He was a good friend. I don't know that he was a very good president, but he never got in any trouble for doing anything. But Mr. Coolidge once, I went to visit him in Northampton, and I said, Calvin, I'd like you and Grace to come over and see me. I'm going to do a show in Boston. And he said, well, Will, what's it going to be? I said, I think I'll probably talk for a couple of hours, and that'll be most of it. He said, well, is there anything else? And I said, there are a couple of people who will sing a song or two at the beginning. And he looked at me and said, Will, we might come. He said, I like music. And, there are humorists like that, that just sort of slip in the knife without looking at you.
And it's kind of especially if they're not known as a humorist, then they
That's right.
take the stage away from you. Mark Twain, you were not alive when Calvin Coolidge became president. You died, I believe, in 1910. But one, you can react to this, or you can also talk about, because you were interested in the political world too, and did you have a favorite president?
Oh, I don't think I had a favorite president, but I did encourage honest men to go into politics because, their honesty would shine forth much more in that field of endeavor than in any other, field. The trouble is with politicians these days, we can't get politicians, who will go into office and stay bought. Well, we can be very grateful that in America we don't have a native criminal class, apart from Congress.
I've always thought they were just children, that didn't grow up. But if you get to know them one at a time, they're all right. Mm-hmm. We used to say that about the Dalton boys and the James gang back where I grew up. One at a time, they're all right. It's when they get together that they get to be kind of a menace. Whenever your congressman comes to see you, you want to hold his hand, keep him at home as long as you can. He can't hurt you much when he's here. It's when he gets up there with those other fellas that talk common sense.
Well, Mr. Rogers, I think you were the one, I think I'm not confused, that you talked about in the U.S. Senate. It's the only body, of course, I guess, government body in the world where the filibuster is acceptable, and you can talk as long as you are physically able to do so, unless they cut it off, and it's very difficult to cut off the filibuster. It takes a very large majority. I believe you also had discussion, it was Mr. Coolidge or someone, about the qualifications for being able to talk as a member of Congress, particularly the Senate.
Well, it wasn't Mr. Coolidge. I was a good friend of mine who's senator down in Kansas, Senator Capper. Senator Capper mostly writes farm journals, but he's a good friend of the farmer. And we were visiting over in the dining room one day, and I said, Capper, I think if there's a principle of mine that if you would follow it up here in the Senate, you'd all be better off. I said, I think the fellow ought to say what he knows and sit down. And I had argued that we'd all be better off if we did that. And he said, well, there's a lot of these people, if we followed that kind of rule, he said, it won't work up here. If we did that, a lot of them would have to sit down right after roll call.
I see.
And some of them maybe before that. So, but anyway, I still think it's a good idea.
Well, Mr.
I've been reading what you have written, and you extended that to preachers, too.
Well, that's true. Yeah, if preachers would follow that rule, a lot of churches wouldn't have to meet but about once a month. Maybe some of them not at all.
Would you like to make a comment further about politicians or ministers, either one?
Well, as I said this morning, I thought I'd make a good preacher if I just had enough religion. But I didn't, so I had to go into another line of business. I used to write letters up to the Territorial Enterprise, and I was always surprised when they printed them. And then one day they asked me to come and report for them. Of course, I'd have done anything that they asked. At the time, I needed money so bad, I would have translated the Talmud from Hebrew, thrown as much style into it as I could for the sake of the money.
Well, let's speak of money. You seem to indicate, Mr. Twain, I had always had another image of you. I thought you did most all your writing and your brilliance in your writing and as a satirist and also with great humor. And I'm somewhat, I guess if I may be candid, disappointed that apparently your writing was all about money.
Well, a writer has to support himself. I testified before Congress on copyright, and I wanted it extended for the life of the writer and his children instead of just 40 years the way it is now. Let the grandkids take care of themselves, but it ought to be for the lifetime of the writer and his family. Every time you talk about writing, about money, though, that green-headed fellow raises, envy. I was in Bermuda with a very wealthy man, Henry Rogers, a multimillionaire. Somebody came up and said, you know, your friend Rogers is a nice fellow. It's too bad, though, that his money is tainted. And I said, oh, it's worse than that. It's twice tainted. Taint yours and taint mine.
Well, Mr. Rogers, you both did well, and you certainly did really well financially.
Well, I did. I learned a lesson when I was very young. I had taken a trip to South America and ended up over in South Africa. I got up to Johannesburg.
You also went down to South America. Tell that story first before you go over there. The two of you went to South America, and you didn't have enough money to come home.
Well, I had developed a little wanderlust, and my papa had put me out on the ranch, given me some calves, and I just couldn't stand it out there. And I'd read in the papers and magazines that a fella could still be a vaquero or a gaucho down in South America. That's South American for cowboy. And so I got a friend of mine to go with me, and we went, going south. We went to New Orleans, and the boat we found was going to New York City, so we went up there. And from New York City, the boat we found was going to London, England, so we went over there. But eventually we got to South America, and I got to see the live versions of the pictures in my school geography book of the Argentine. But my friend, Dick Paris, said, well, I'm homesick, and have we got enough money to go home? And we counted our money. We had enough for one ticket, and I kind of figured I'd got him into it. So I gave him my part of the money, and he went home. I found a job. I knew I better not write to Papa, so I found a job taking care of cows and horses, but they were on a boat that was going to South Africa. So that's how I got over there. I got off in Durban. I followed the cows up to Johannesburg. And when I got there, I saw a newspaper, had an advertisement in it by a fellow named, he called himself Texas Jack. He was doing a Wild West show. And he was looking for somebody who could spin a rope, which I figured was me. And so I went and introduced myself. I said, sir, I'd like to try out for this position. He said, well, I'd give you $50 to do a version of the Big Crinoline. I said, oh, I can do that. And I did. He said, well, I'll hire you on. He said, I'll pay you $20 a week. And I was employed. And the next day I had a fellow who was also in the show who came to me and said, well, you're a fool. And I looked at him kind of funny. He said, Rogers, he said, Jack offered somebody $250 to do that trick last week. And I went to ask him about the money, and he said, well, if you do it for $50, I'll just pay you $50. So I did. And I learned a lesson, about money, which is, you got to figure out how to get what you can get at the beginning. And I've been very fortunate, but I learned then, that you have to look out for yourself.
Well, Mr. Twain, he was around the world, and sometimes money came in this. He couldn't get home when we did certain things, and so would you like to respond to, did you have these same kind of adventures?
Well, I traveled a lot. In fact, I wrote more travel books than anything else. Even Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was a kind of a picaresque novel. There's just no more plot to it than going down the river. Travel literature is good. People are interested in distant places. If you're a preacher, I knew a preacher one time that he'd never preach about the need that people had in his neighborhood because he couldn't get any money. But he'd preach about somebody that needed it, cannibals in Fiji. Why, he'd just get inundated with money. And people are funny like that.
And it's still true, We're willing to send missionaries all over the world, or Marines sometimes. But it's pretty hard to get money to help folks that are suffering because of the drought down in Texas and Colorado and Oklahoma. And they don't have enough money to put food on the table.
I think we ought to have the missionaries in China come back here. I mean, there are people with some courage. And those are the kind of people that we need to face down a lynch mob, for example. In Missouri recently, there was a lynching, and now we have this reputation as Missouri as a state where people get lynched. I wish the missionaries had come home and convert these Christians. That's what we need.
Well, I think something the audience would love. Oh, there's a wonderful group out there, and they seem to be enjoying this conversation that you're having. I'm going to do something that I think would be really clever. And both of you have great stories. And I'm going to ask each one of you, and we'll start with you, Will Rogers, I want you to tell Mark Twain a story, and then let him react to your story.
You mean I tell him a story about me, or am I going to tell him
No,
his
about
story?
you, but
I tell a story about yourself, and I'm going to have Mark Twain to critique your story, and then we'll reverse that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to tell a story about honesty, about learning about honesty. I was in the first grade. I was living with my sister Sally and going to school up at Drumgoole, which was mostly an Indian school. I had just about enough white blood in me that nobody trusted me. But Sally's house was about 3 miles from the school, and I rode an old pony, old Minnie, back and forth to school every day. And most days I would take my rope along, and one day as I was going along, well, there was a turkey that was running along the side of the road, and I said to myself, I don't believe I've ever roped a turkey before. And so I got a little loop going, and I threw it out in front of me. I got it over the turkey's head, which I didn't understand exactly what was going to happen when I did that, but it sort of frightened the turkey, and it tried to fly. And when it did, it broke its neck. And I realized I'd created a bit of a problem. So I got down off the horse. I went over and tried to prop the turkey up, and that didn't work. So I picked it up. It wasn't very far to a house, and I took the turkey in my arms and went up on the porch and knocked on the door. The lady that came was a friend of my sister Sally. I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, but I believe I've probably killed one of your turkeys. And she looked at me, and she looked at the bird, and she said, yes, Will, I believe you have. And then almost before I could think, she said, we'll be back here this afternoon at 4:30. We're going to have dinner. Well, I didn't have much choice, so I was there. Now, I don't know if you've ever been part of a dinner, that you were responsible for. But I can tell you it didn't taste very good. But I had a little bit, and I went on home. And when I got home, I said to my sister, I said, how much do you think a turkey like that is worth? And she said she guessed probably about $2.50 or $3. Well, I didn't have that much, but I knew I could save nickels and dimes for a while, and I did for 2 or 3 months until I had $3. And I went back, and I knocked on the door. The lady opened it. She looked back down at me. Maybe she was wondering where the turkey was this time. I held out my hand, and I put the $3 in coins in her hand. I said, I'm sorry, and I thank you. She said, thank you, Will. Well, it wasn't much of a reward for all the discipline of that time, but I can tell you it made me feel a whole lot better. And I think that a lot of times when we try to be honest and deal honestly with other people, maybe the only reward we're going to get is that kind of a feeling, but it's a good one. And so that's my story. Well, sounds a little like a preacher story, doesn't it?
Yeah. It does sound like a preacher.
Sally said my mama wanted me to be a preacher, and I've always been. I lost her when I was just 10 years old, but in some ways I'm kind of glad she never knew I slipped and became an actor.
So what do you think of that story, Mr. Twain?
I think that's a very fine story. It's not just a story that amuses. It has a moral, has a lesson. It is kind of a preacher's story, and those are the best kind. Those are the stories that last and people learn from them. And there's stories about boys, of course. That's you can't miss there. In Tom Sawyer, as soon as Aunt Polly hollered, Tom, everybody reading the book knew that he was in trouble because he was a boy. And I remember going to school as a youngster. I remember the first day very distinctly. The rules were laid out and the punishments were not described, but they were there. And I violated one, and they got corrected and told that if I did that again, well, of course, I had to do it again. And then the punishment, I had to go out and pick a switch outside in the bushes. And I was glad that the teacher picked me to go get the switch, because I figured I would find the right one. And I did. I found an old hickory switch. There were a lot of hickory, but the one I found was pretty rotten. And when I brought it in, she said, "Oh, this is no good." So she sent out a more competent child than I was. And he brought one in that was about as thick as a thumb, and that was applied, and I learned that lesson. And then, that was for my moral improvement. But really, the lesson that ended my education was the summer after my father died. There was an epidemic of measles in the village, and for a while there, a child died almost every day. And parents were just terrified and kept the children inside, nothing to do but read the Bible and sing hymns and say prayers. And life on those terms was not worth living. So I decided to get the measles and get it over with one way or another. So I went next door and crawled in bed with a boy that had the measles. And sure enough, I got a case of them. I was very sick for a while. But I got better and disappointed everybody. But that ended my schooling, and Mother apprenticed me to a printer. And I think you learn more when you're working at it.
Well, we got on a lot of stories there that was most interesting, and but we need to have you to. Of course, you told 2 or 3, but you need to tell another story to Will Rogers and let him. What got us going on that? Because you were talking about the moral story here, and there's always stories about boys, but give him some story that he can respond to.
I don't know stories about cowboys, although the one I alluded to earlier today occurred in the northeast corner of Colorado. We were going out to Nevada, where Orion had been appointed. He worked in Lincoln's campaign, and he got himself appointed secretary to the territorial governor, just at the time the Civil War broke out. And I figured that was time for me to go out of the states, too, because they were looking for people to fight. And I did for 2 weeks, but I saw more retreating than the man that invented it. So I went to the captain and told him the war had become a disappointment. So I withdrew and crippled the Southern cause to that extent. But on the way out, we saw buffalo for the first time. Oh my, they were big animals, and we heard the story about the man who shot at one and didn't do anything but irritate the buffalo, who chased him. And there weren't many trees, but he found one on the prairie and climbed it, and the buffalo came right up after him. He unloaded his whole gun before the buffalo.
Just angered the buffalo more.
Angered him. And people said that I made that story up, but I didn't. And there were lots of people going west, and there were a lot of buffalo, and something like that must have happened sometime, right?
I'm sure it must have. Surely there was a tree somewhere between there. Now, Will Rogers, how do you respond?
Oh, well, I'm always happy to hear stories about the West.
Yes.
I never read very many books, but my favorite book is a book by Mr. Owen Wister, called The Virginian. And what I liked about it is that it happens out in the West, in the time when fellas could get on a horse and a saddle and ride into the sunsets, or encounter these big beasts, like the buffaloes. And I'm kind of sorry that I didn't get to live through very much of that. I had an opportunity to go on one cattle drive, but it was kind of short, and it was a few years after most cattle drives had finished. But I got to see enough to know that, the reality of that was good. And the other thing about a story, it needs to be honest and true. And I think, when you write or when you tell a story, that's important. You try to tell the truth. Sometimes it hurts people's feelings. But I think it's the secret, even to humor, to tell the truth.
I don't know. We might disagree about this, but I've often said that there's nothing that spoils good literature like too much truth. It's the most precious thing we have. Don't misunderstand me. And that's why we ought to economize.
Well, I think you have to be careful who you aim it at.
Yeah, that's true.
I never tried to tell gags on people that were already hurting. You pick on the big men, and if they can't take it, then they're really probably not big men.
One thing you have in common, neither one of you had a lot of formal education, and I know, Mr. Rogers, you talked earlier yesterday about, I think you stayed a long time in the fourth grade, but you never did proceed past that, and Mr. Twain, you've talked about that. So I have some terms I want to use and get both of you to react to this term, and we'll start with that one, education. Mark Twain, do you want to go first?
Well, my comment about education is that I always tried not to let my schooling interfere with my education. And I would advise young people to follow that, too.
Well, I would agree. I think most of what you learn, you probably don't learn in the school books. I remember some of the McGuffey's readers and Ray's arithmetic and geography pictures and all of that. But the real lessons, I think, you learn from from being out there by yourself or with your friends.
I'm not sure we should invite you to North Idaho College because they may all withdraw from school now that we've had you here. We may have zero enrollment.
Well, I don't say that as advice. I sent all my own kids on to college.
Yes, you did, didn't you?
But for some of us, the classroom is just a little too cramped.
Well, another term, I have several here because in your great writings, you could take anything and deal with really a great story. My next term is marriage.
Well, I spoke not long ago to a school, a girls' school, and I advise moderation. I think that's that they ought to drink in moderation, smoke in moderation, marry in moderation.
My perspective on marriage is altered somewhat by having lived in California for several years and being in the movies. I'm about the only person out there, I think, who has the same wife he went with. But and I'm holding on to her too. I know several men who I think would probably make better husbands for my wife than I do, but I'm not going to let them have her. And but I do think that we probably need to bring about some kind of reform in the country to help out the preacher class. And by that I mean that we need to make the cost of getting married as high as the cost of getting a divorce. And as it is now, the lawyers get all the money, and the preachers are going broke. And if we could somehow make marriage a little more expensive, then I think people would be willing to think of it as a larger investment. And along the way, we'd probably help some of these folks to be able to feed their own families, the preachers, I mean.
So it balanced economically between
That's
the
right.
lawyers and the preachers, yeah.
Yeah, we made a movie just a couple of years ago out on the border between California and Nevada called Lightning. And it was about a hotel where, you could go and stay for 5 or 6 weeks and establish residence and get a divorce. It was just chock full of California people, that had gone over to live in Nevada. And, we make these movies, as kind of stories, but this one's kind of true. And I think we probably need to change that situation.
My next term, that's actually a good one. I may add that one too, as we're dealing with all this here. But my next term is politics.
Well, I've always tried to live honest, and so I've stayed out of politics if I can. But, of course, I write for the papers. And a lot of people I talk to don't want to talk much about politics, but other people say, well, do you write your own stuff when you do that? And I say, well, I just go to Washington, drop in, see how the boys is doing, and I report the facts. because they can do more crazy things than I can think up. But I've had the good opportunities over the years of getting to know a number of people in politics, congressmen and senators and several presidents as well. And I think we've had we've had some very great presidents. Of course, everybody, and Mr. Twain could probably confirm this, everybody in my time thinks that if we would be all right if we just, if people would do things like Mr. Lincoln did them. It's kind of like wishing for the Savior to come back, and I don't think he's going to do it. I think we're going to have to go ahead and live our lives as best we can. And it's like Lincoln. We're not going to get him back. He may have been a good president. But the truth is, we want to elect a magician. We want a Houdini. We don't want somebody to just step into the White House and do what he thinks is best. So we're happy to go along with him as long as the sun's shining. But let it start to rain, and almost everybody I know wants goulashes and raincoats, at government expense. And that's the sad thing about the president, and he's got to deal with all of that. And so in the sunshine, we've got good presidents, but every party and every candidate is always better when he's out of office trying to get in than when he's in, then everybody wants him out.
Mr. Twain.
I don't have hardly anything compared to that to say about politicians. I think I kept better company than Mr. Rogers did. But about bringing the Savior back, that'd be a mistake. They'd do the same thing to him this time they did last.
Well, the next issue or word that I want you to get a reaction to is religion.
Religion. Well, I think that there's a great deal of stories that are valuable in the Bible, and many stories that aren't. I think they ought to teach the whole Bible, not just the good parts, but the bad parts too. The parts where people are killed and children are slaughtered. All of which happens according to divine providence, they say. I'm not so sure that is the case. I've written a lot about religion. Almost none of it has been published, and won't be published for 100 years because my literary executors would get hanged if it was all published. I've written about heaven. They're funny people, dying to get into heaven. So many people I've known have gone to a better place that I'm decided just about that I don't want to go there. I'll go somewhere else. There was a conversation at dinner one night. I was visiting and a guest in somebody's home, and they could talk about heaven and hell, and I didn't say anything. Finally, the hostess said, well, Sam, you must have something to say on this subject. And I said, well, I do. But I must hold my peace because I've got friends in both places. I always say heaven for climate, but hell for society.
Well, Rogers, how would you respond?
Well, I'm for religion. I believe that all religions are good. Not a single one of them is bad. But I do think that when a fellow gets connected to one of them and believes it's the only religion, that usually leads to some trouble. Because then he goes to trying to convert everybody to his form of belief, and he stops thinking about the good that's in the other fellow's belief. And I think probably if we'd leave people alone and let them do things the way they've developed to do them over the years, that most of them would be better off. I was born in Indian Territory, and there was a good deal of religion there. My mother was a very devout Methodist, and as I said, I think she wanted me to grow up and be a preacher, which would have been a disappointment to her. But over the years, I've listened, to a lot of preachers, and I found myself in a number of churches substituting. I think I got that word right. filling in for, the preacher. And they would sometimes introduce me and get me to talking, and then I'd just keep talking, and they wouldn't have to preach a sermon. They'd get to save it for another week. But, and I never converted anybody. But I think religion, as I understand it, it's pretty simple. The Savior gave us a few rules, and he said, love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that's probably what we ought to do. And if we'd do it, and if we'd do it simply and without trying to convince everybody else how important it was for them to do it too, we'd probably be better off.
The next word is business.
Well, businessmen, there are businessmen today. I'm disappointed with them. They will stoop to do things for $1 million that they ought not do for less than $2 million. The ethics of our business, God-fearing Christian businessmen, is just not what it ought to be.
Well, I've had the opportunity to get to know a number of the businessmen in my own time, Mr. Ford, and Mr. Edison, Mr. Carnegie, Mr. Roosevelt. I mean, I don't know them really well. I said Roosevelt. I meant Mr. Rockefeller, the fellow that keeps giving dimes away. But most of them are fine folks, and some of them are very, very bright. My personal favorite, I suppose, is Mr. Ford, who has used his business to help us all. I bet there's not a single person out here that doesn't have a Ford in his garage of some sort. And it's because Mr. Ford, he didn't invent the automobile. It wasn't that he had the idea, but he figured out how to build it so that everybody could afford to have one. And that's how business thrives, is efficiency. And he figured out how to build the Model T, so you didn't have any choice about the color, but you didn't have to pay very much for it. And I saw him not very long ago, asked him, he just dropped the price of the car to $400. And I said, Henry, how can you afford to do that? And he said, Will, if I can control the sale of the parts, I believe I can give the cars away. He said, every one of them will shake off enough bolts in the first year to pay for itself. And after that, everything is just pure profit. Well, now, you see, that's a business mind at work. That would never have occurred to me. But that's the kind of fellow we need in the White House, somebody with that sense of economy.
Well, another term that's most interesting is the field of sports and athletics.
Well, I was down in spring training. That's just, not very long ago, and I visited with a fellow that I met a year or two ago, playing baseball up north, named Babe Ruth. And he's quite a sportsman, he is. And he's done things, on the baseball diamond that a lot of people would not have ever thought possible. And we've raised sports in this country, to such a high level that I don't see how education could possibly survive without the football teams. And most universities in my part of the country, down in the South where I came from, they really don't pay too much attention to education until they've got the football squared away. Now there are a few places up north. When I was in Boston the other month, I heard about the football team at Harvard, and they've not scored a touchdown in almost 2 years, and I don't see how they're getting students. But they're not getting them from the South. And but we've made heroes of some of these people in sports, and some of them are very deserving men and women as well. But my son Jim's been traveling around the country looking for a place, where the shoulder pads fit him. He's looking for college himself, but he hadn't found one yet. And I hope he does. It'd help our pocketbook a little.
Yeah, it would help. Yeah.
I said this morning that I am not in favor. I'm not very fond of pedestrianism, and the same applies to sports. Rogers tried to get me to play golf. I said that's just a good walk spoiled.
and has created more liars than anything since income tax.
It has.
Another term that's really interesting, and you as both great writers, and you were so powerful because you could take humor, but humor always has a message, and sometimes it's the most powerful of all. And another term that is really found in writing really quite often is the seeking of happiness.
Oh, well, we all want to be happy, and I think that's why sometimes we can get so irritated, because we're disappointed. We make mistakes, and it sounds just terrible under those circumstances. I remember one time shaving, and I cut myself, and I used all the language necessary to heal. I thought the door to the bedroom was closed, but it wasn't. And my wife, Livy, was in there, and when I came out, she repeated all the words. I said, well, if that's how I sound, I'll never say those words again. You got all the words right, Livy, but you don't know the tune. So, I think that those less than happy moments come about because we really do want happiness, but we just don't know how to go about it. We try to make ourselves happy, but that's not how happiness comes. Happiness comes by doing the right thing, and then happiness just kind of comes along behind that. I'm happiest when I'm working the hardest and trying to think of ways to get out of it. And I'm better off when I can't think of ways to get out of it.
I can't imagine how a fella could be happier than sitting in the saddle, chasing after a calf. But I got a letter a month or two ago from a fellow named Will Durant, and he's writing a book about philosophies. He has the idea that a person's philosophy is the way that he finds happiness. And he asked me if I had one, and I started to think. And finally I said, well, Mr. Durant, I can't imagine a fellow like me having a philosophy, really, but I said, here's what I think. I said, none of us is going to be on this earth, for very long. And so what you need to do is get a few laughs, do the very best you can at whatever you're doing, try to live honest, and, live your life so that whenever you lose, you're ahead. I don't see how you can do a whole lot better than that. Kind of simple, but that's what I think.
I have one more word, and then I have one other thing for both of you. But in our time, the year 2007, we talk more about this. There are principles of democracy, and usually most people talk about three cornerstones or principles, and those are freedom and equality and justice. And how would you react to those principles that we talk so much about in our time? It's been talked about, certainly going back to the Declaration of Independence and in other societies, but how would you, my first idea was to talk about freedom, but I'm going to incorporate all three for you to react to: freedom, equality, and justice.
Well, everybody wants those things for himself. Problem comes that other people want those things too. And so there's competition for it, and we don't want to acknowledge the need that other people have for those same things. They're great ideals, but you need to work on them. They don't happen by themselves. And if we wouldn't be so selfish, we might be able to spread the wealth and the freedom and the justice and the happiness around. But the ego gets in the way. And we don't know. If I were king, then poor people would not have bread and clothing and shelter alone, but they would have teachings out of books for full belly is not worth much when the mind is empty. And I suppose that's the way to get those things that we say we want, but don't quite know how to go about getting. I think maybe teachings out of books might help.
Not a thing wrong with any one of us except selfishness. And it is, as you say, that a lot of times we ruin the idea of equality because we just want a little more for ourselves. But I think we sometimes get it a little crooked, too, when we believe that we've achieved these things, in our country. Now, I'm part Cherokee Indian, and I'm not here to complain about that, but I know, that not everybody believes that Indians deserve to be treated the same way as everybody else, and so they don't, the equality question is a question that's there. And my history goes back to, not my own, but my papa's history goes back to the Civil War. So we know something about equality. Papa inherited a couple of slaves from his father. And, well, these are all very desirable things, that you talk about. I think when we get into trouble is when we believe that we've achieved them and think that we have the solution to helping other people to get them. Now, yes, we do want to share, but sometimes the best way to share them with another country is not necessarily to send Marines, we seem like the last few years we're willing to send Marines almost anywhere it asks for them. And I would say, probably better to let people live according to their own way, their own habits, even if maybe it doesn't look exactly like the kind of equality and democracy that we worship in this country, and have a kind of, even reverence for.
I have one final thing, then I'm going to have you go out of character, and some people may be in the audience that don't know who you are. But it might be Mark Twain from some of your writings and incidents there. It might be about you. And I know Will Rogers has a story that happened to him, and he may want to use that one. I was just so amused about your story about the steer that decided he wanted to go up and sit in the audience. That may be the one you want to tell. And then Mark Twain, some story about someone in real trouble. We'll let Will Rogers start, but when you're in a real fix and how you to get out of it. You may want to tell a different one, Will Rogers, but
well, that's okay. I'm always willing to tell the one that that'll pay the best, and
that may be the one you get paid the best for. Then,
I don't think there's anything wrong with recycling stories. The gag is good. It's good in a lot of different places. Now, I'd gone up to New York City with a friend of my papa's, Mr. Mulhall. He was doing a Wild West show. And we were in Madison Square Garden. The garden was kind of a new place in New York City, so we were proud to be there. It was a large place, and seats all around, and then a floor down the bottom. Some of us were dressed up as cowboys, some as Indians. There were cattle and horses all over the floor. And there was a big longhorn steer, about as tall as my head just about, who decided that he wanted to see the show from a seat up in the second balcony. And so he took out for it by way of the audience. And a couple of cowboys went after him. They weren't having any luck. And I realized we could be in for some trouble here, as well as just some excitement. And so I got my rope, and I went up after him. I was going up steps just as fast as I could. I got a loop going over my head, threw it way out, got it over both horns at the same time, pulled it tight just as he got, I guess, to the seat he was going for, and he sat down. He looked back down, thought about it for a minute, and I think he decided it wasn't the seat he wanted after all, because he started back down. And I followed him.
You had much choice.
There wasn't anything else I could do and hold on to the rope. And when he got to the bottom, and there was a rail around all the arena at the bottom, and he made a real leap and very gracefully went right over the rail, which I decided is what I would do too when I got there. And and then the lights went out. And when they came back on, I was in my hotel room. And a friend held a newspaper up in front of my face. He said, "Will, you're a hero. Look." And I looked, and right there in the paper was a picture of a fellow with my shirt on, lying face down in the dirt. And the caption under the picture says, "Cowboy hero saves audience from wild cow." Yorkers didn't know the difference between a cow and a steer. But at any rate, my friend said, well, this is your opportunity, I think, to get into vaudeville, which, that got me out of a spot. And so I did. I pretty soon I was working for $200 a week and traveling just about everywhere.
So
Dayton and
that
Columbus.
steer deserved a lot of credit.
Well, I guess he deserves a lot of credit. I mean, I don't know that if I would. What's the word you used for things happening because they were just supposed to?
Providence.
Providence. That's a long word, but.
And he only got paid half that. He could have two short words if he'd have thought of them.
I mean, I don't know if it happened on purpose or not,
Yeah.
but I mean, it could have been somebody's purpose.
Now, Mr. Twain, give us a story about someone in predicament.
Well, this person in predicament that I'm thinking of, Huck Finn, got out of trouble, he thought, by praying. Now, he knew. He'd been to Sunday school once or twice, but that was enough to know that stealing gets you sent to hell. And it finally dawned on him what he was doing with Jim. He was as good as stealing them. And so he decided to kneel down and pray. And he couldn't pray because you can't pray a lie. And he really didn't want to give Jim up. But finally he decided that that's what he needed to do. So he wrote a letter to Jim's owner, Mistress Watson. Said that her Jim was down here below Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has him on his farm, and you'll give him up for the reward. Oh, he said, I felt so clean and washed, free from sin, I'd come this close to going to hell. And then he got to thinking about Jim and what a good time they had on the river and how good a friend Jim was, and how I always called him honey, how he stood his watch on top of his own when they were on the water. And he said, and he looked at that letter and he tore it up and said, all right, let's go to hell. And he kind of learned, I think, about prayer that way. That I could offer that book as proof that in any collision between a person's conscience and their heart, the heart ought to win out over conscience all the time. Of course, there's that word. I learned a simpler lesson than that myself about prayer. We had a teacher who said prayer is always answered. And the little girl that had the desk not right next to mine in the classroom was the baker's daughter. She had a piece of gingerbread about like that. She always kept it under her desktop. But one day it was out on top. And I just prayed that she would look the other way. And she did. And I got the gingerbread. I never had prayer answered that fast in all my life. So I became very, very devout. But the prayers never worked after that. She kept the gingerbread under her desk more securely than ever. So I've always been suspicious about prayer. But
Well, ladies and gentlemen, our wonderful guests have to go do 2 TV shows shortly, but for you who don't really know who they are, we're going to move out of character and just at least let me introduce them. They both have very distinguished backgrounds. Both are educators, and certainly they're well-read and know the literature. First of all, I'll introduce to you, and let me give you his background, is Dr. George Freeman here, Freeman, and he is a professor of philosophy and religion, and he earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Glennon College in St. Louis, Missouri, and his bachelor's degree in divinity from St. Louis Theological Seminary, and his master's degree in history from St. Louis University, and his PhD in religion from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and he taught for many years as professor at the University of North Dakota, and more recently he moved to South Carolina, where he's an adjunct faculty member at Furman University. Let's thank Dr. George Freeman. And Will Rogers is really Dr. Doug Watson, and he holds degrees in English, including a bachelor's degree from Baylor University, a master's degree from West Texas State, and a doctorate from Texas Tech University. And he began this particular conversations with Will Rogers years ago, and he said he can't remember how many times he has done it. He's also an educator, and he is from, as we said, Oklahoma. And he told me that he's retiring at the end of this year, and that'll be a loss to his students, but he'll be doing other things. And let's give a great big welcome also to Dr. Doug Watson.
Thank you.
We thank you. You've been great all week, and we've had great attendance. And we have one more program for you. We hope you'll come this evening when Terry Jones, our very gifted director, will be doing a concert here at 7:30 that's free, and it will be the big band music of the 1940s. And thank you very much. Thank you.